For some folks, saving for the future is easy, but for you, it might take a little more effort. Saving for your future is your responsibility, and there's a lot to save for.
I never thought of that.
Like your child's education, perhaps uncovered medical expenses, or just to be sure you can live the way you want when you retire. The time is now to save for tomorrow. Save now or work forever. The choice is yours. Choose to save.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
I'm Bettina Lawton. I'm your host for Women Talk Business, a program endorsed by the Executive Women's Roundtable and Tyson's Corner. With us tonight is Dawn McCoy. We're talking about leadership building blocks, which coincidentally is the title of her book, which you can get on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, or FlourishLeadership.com. It's a very good book. We were talking about visioning when we left, and I wanted to go back to that and make sure that we wrap it up, because to me that's a very, very important piece of this whole thing.
It is.
You don't have the vision together, the rest of it becomes an awful slog, I would think.
Absolutely. If you don't have sort of the big picture about what it is that you are going to accomplish, or what it is that you set forth, not just having sort of a, oh, I'm going to be, or I will achieve this, or at some end some, but making sure there is an action plan and that there are milestones to mark this. I make this very clear, not only in the book, but in talks that I give about making sure that people really have a personal accountability, much like I talked about in the experience I had of getting there and knowing I have personal accountability for an issue, but more importantly, personal accountability to a bigger process of being a leader.
Now, the plan that you have, is the vision supposed to be a really big vision, so it encompasses everything? Because if you have a plan, one of the things I hear people always say to justify not having a plan, by the way, is, well, if I plan too much, then I don't have the flexibility to meet the varying needs, blah, blah, blah. I mean, how specific in terms of a vision and in terms of the plan do you need to have in order for that personal accountability piece to have any meaning?
Exactly. One of the things in the back of the book I included appendix, because I was asked this question so many times actually about having timelines. It doesn't have to be a grand plan. It doesn't have to be detailed and written out in 10 pages. It just needs to be something very clear and definitive to you. What I talk about is making sure that people have action items in specific measurable timeframes, a 3, 6, or 9 month time frame, for example, so that they're holding themselves accountable for when the issues will be done or when that task will be accomplished. Without having that sort of vision up front, then it really is not about trying to be a leader, it's about being something else.
Okay. Is that something else, the sort of self-aggrandizement that says, ooh, aren't I special? I got elected to the school board kind of thing?
Exactly. Or those who are just using positions for stepping stones. I think that the challenge is too often we have people who will be in a leadership position just to get there and use it as leverage to get somewhere else, rather than really giving everything they have to that one position without thinking about next steps or future career politics or future business leader, whoever. It is about what can you do in that one position and how do you scope that out with a vision.
Now, do you, because I know you work with political candidates and you also work with nonprofit folks.
Right.
So is that one of the things when you meet with somebody that you get to like first up, like what's the vision, where are we going with this, to sort of help folks massage and get a little clarity on that?
That's absolutely right. With the coaching and consulting that I do, it is right up front. Where are we going? What is the end goal here? And what action plan do you already have written out? Doesn't need to be written out in clear detail, but it needs to be something that is saying, okay, here's what I'm trying to do. We all know people who go to school. You don't go to school just to do it sort of at random.
Right.
You go to school for a specific degree.
One hopes.
Well, over a
As a mother, one hopes.
And we can only hope that. But we hope that people would think, okay, if I'm going for this period of time or this particular degree, we go with something in mind. And think of it in terms of that. I actually include like a quiz, if you will, in part of the book to give people sort of a test for themselves to see if they're ready. Okay. If they're not, then they can sort of say, okay, let me come back to this a little later.
I'll be ready at a different time.
That's right.
Now, we talked a lot, and your second leadership building block is pretty self-evident from what we've been talking about, because it's about balance. It's a balancing act. It's keeping all those balls going. It's taking care of yourself, which I think is the first part of the balancing act that you talk to in your book. It's making sure that you are taking care of yourself so you can actually do what your vision is going to require.
That's right. And in the work that I did, as I talk about burning that midnight oil, it wasn't just burning the midnight oil. It was making sure that I was taking time out to also relax, taking time out to work in the garden, and taking time out to be with my support system, my family and friends. And so it is about making sure that you have that equal commitment, but creating a checklist for yourself about what works for you. Too often we as leaders forget that we need to sort of check in with self and check in with family and friends. And unfortunately, that's where people get tasked or sort of burnt out a little too quickly.
Well, and I see that in a number of different folks. You can just sort of watch them at these community meetings and you think, they are exhausted.
Yes,
you know,
right.
How do they survive this stuff? But I think one of the things in that section of your book that you talk about as well, that you mentioned briefly, is this concept of a supportive network of people you can go to who it isn't going to appear on the front page of the Post tomorrow morning. And I think that's an important piece for people to be able to disengage.
Yes, it is. To be able to pull back. I talk about it being a safety net. Maybe you have an inner circle of friends who you can spend time with, where you can just sort of unwind and relax. But it's also about making sure that you have in the political arena what we call the kitchen cabinet. Those advisors, those close around you who can be your confidants, who can give you key feedback and be able to give you the support you need in a confidential kind of way, but also to help maintain that balance between your public role and sort of that private decision making that you do as a leader.
Well, one of the things, and when I read it in the book, it was sort of like, well, of course. But until I read it, it was kind of like I was going along on reading the balancing part thinking, oh, balance, yeah, that's always really great, but seriously, who has time? Was the concept that you had about you set parameters and the priority. So it ties back to your vision. You can have a list of 50 things to do, but it's that process of saying, well, wait a second, is this getting me anywhere on the overall goal, on my check mark, on my vision, on that plan? And I think that's a step a lot of people forget, is you have to prioritize when you're in a leadership position.
It is, and that's actually something that really, for me, was refined when I made that transition between candidate to actual elected leader, because it was a skill I needed to really refine, having not only a full-time job, having a school board role where meetings were often twice a week. We had meetings that went for hours, sometime past midnight. And so being able to juggle the role, but saying, okay, my priorities here need to be in balance, and how to really pull back so that I could have my vision and action plan really carried forth to support the school district and to support my own personal goals.
Wow, that's a tough schedule. Now, you also talk about courageous focus. That's your third leadership building block, which when I read it, I was kind of like, really? What is that about? Tell us what that's about.
Well, courageous focus is about having the energy to just continue to go through when you're not quite sure how, not sure if you can, and not sure if you will. And I think that at the very start of my school board experience, it was one where I said, wow, I need to make sure I get up and keep on going. Like I say, that midnight oil. And really digging down deep. It was sort of looking at not only my upbringing, the training that I had at home from parents who were in leadership positions, but also being a former athlete, running track and field, and knowing that came into play about really having that courage to continue to forge ahead, even though the microphone was turned off, even though I was told not to ask questions, and even though I sort of challenged the system and said we needed to look at policies that needed to be revamped and updated to make sure that we were doing all we could for the students. And so it really is about making sure to have that constant focus about how do we have the courage and the energy to keep going when we're not sure that we can.
Well, you talk in that part of your book about self-discipline and finding ways and systems and keeping to them, and that notion of going and going and going and figuring it out, and just, if this isn't working, then you redo. You don't just keep, you know, banging your head against the wall. You figure out, how am I going to get, again, the vision. Back to that vision.
It is.
Back to doing that.
And back to getting back to the original plan. When I found that sometimes I was hitting roadblocks, either with the decisions I was making, the votes I was making, was not getting the support. We had a split board, really, essentially a 4-3 split. And I was on the dissenting end. And so how to make sure that I could gradually get that to be a 5-2 split, which I did by the end of the tenure, to gain the support from colleagues. And so how to say, okay, this isn't working if I keep going this way. But if I start to make sure that I ask different questions or start to present things in a different way, as we know in politics and business that we need to do, find a happy medium and compromising, that helped me to really achieve that courage and really keep going through.
Wow. That is the hard part of trying to figure out how do you make that shift where you're not giving up on your vision, but you're effective. As a friend of mine says to me all the time, Bettina, is it effective and is it efficient?
Right.
And if you just keep sort of saying, I got to get there, I got to do that. Now you also have your fourth leadership building block is dynamic creativity. And we would all like to think we are just so dynamic and creative, which may not always be true. Talk for a little bit about that.
Well, I thought about that actually from the beginning to the end of my tenure on the school board. I've always been a very creative person with the arts, but I thought about how do we be innovative? How do we be out the box when we think about what we're trying to do in decision making? How do we think about how to garner support? And how do we think about how do we leave things behind? And we'll talk about that a little bit further down. But I think creativity was really about time management and being organized. As I mentioned, I often had board meetings that went on for endless hours. Or sometimes I would have a stack of paper to read and, you know, it was like, okay, we're having a meeting in 2 days. Please read this. And you know from obviously the work that you do, I mean, it's just extraordinary. And, you know, trying to make sure to comb through the material. So I talked about it being about game time. You know, get ready for game time. And if people think of it in terms of getting ready for whatever sort of competitive situation they may know themselves or from sports on television, that how do we really get ourselves ready for game time? And how do we sort of look at it as being organized in our approach, but also making sure that we have that time management. If we don't take charge of our time and really get creative with the limited resource of time we have, or in my case, limited staff and time, then we really will do ourselves a disservice.
Well, that's something that when I was reading the dynamic part and it started talking about time management, I thought, no one really thinks time management is a creative thing. That's not what you immediately think of when you think of creativity. But when you don't have enough time for what you have to get done, that's where that whole creative process does come into play. You've got to be able to figure it out. So we will talk some more about that when we come back. We are coming into our last segment with Dawn McCoy, who has written a book called Leadership Building Blocks, and we will be back to talk some more about how to make yourself a great leader. Stay with us.
She's had more than a dozen fractures. And in the next few years, she faces 2 major surgeries to strengthen her fragile bones. She's only 10 years old. Most people don't worry about fragile bones until late in life. For those with osteogenesis imperfecta, brittle bones are a concern throughout their lifetime. Find out how you can strengthen this child's future.
Diabetes is a killer. After I was diagnosed, I didn't feel sick, so I didn't listen to my doctor. Then it struck. I had a heart attack, then a stroke, and I was only 49.
Most people with diabetes also have high blood pressure and cholesterol, which can cause severe heart damage. In fact, 2 out of 3 people with diabetes die from heart disease or stroke.
Don't let diabetes destroy your life.
Call for your free diabetes survival guide. Choose to live.